morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. Okay. I just want a word or two of introduction, and then we'll get started. I want to remind everybody that this is actually the first of three pre-Shavuot Shiurim that ideally would have been given as part of our Tikkun Leil Shavuot. Okay? And the second of Jack Prince will give tomorrow at 11, and the third Rabbi Yasker on Wednesday on the Book of Ruth at 10 o'clock. And also to remind you that on Thursday morning at 11 o'clock, we will have the opportunity to do a siyum on the entire Chumash. We were successful in getting more than the number of parshas, close to 60 people at least participating. And we will have some remarks then, as well as a Yisker service and the reading of Megillat Ruth by Ari Cohen. And so I encourage you to participate. Also, I would encourage you and share with our shul people and our neighbors that on Thursday night, after dinner, for example, if one can take half hour, 45 minutes to sit and take a sefer, let it be a Chumash or a Mishnah or a Gemara, whatever you're comfortable with, to sit and learn a little bit and feel that as a community, in that regard, we're also participating in a Tikkun Leil Shavuot, even though we may not be physically together. Okay? I also want to take the opportunity to thank Ira Epstein, who was so kind to send me 2 academic articles based on the topic that we're going to discuss today, which is what is Akdamut, when is it said, and why? Okay? So I'm going to get started by giving us the example of when we hear the term piyutim. I'm sure many of us think of the high holidays, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And throughout both occasions, we encounter a number of these liturgical poems, some written by Eliezer HaKalir, others by some equally familiar Hebrew poets and philosophers like Solomon ibn Gabirol. But Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are not the only holidays for which such piyutim were written. We're all familiar with the term slichot. These are poems emphasizing requests for Hashem's forgiveness, but they are not only part of Yom Kippur. They also form a major component of the service that is recited an entire week before the holidays, starting on Motzei Shabbat and leading up to the Yamim Noraim. Another example would be on Sukkot, when we're in shul or not, carrying the lulav and etrog, and we march around, we recite a series of Hoshanot. These also are liturgical poems that seek Hashem's salvation. And even on Shabbat, we might be surprised to know that there is such a piyut, a liturgical poem, because that is the prayer Kel Adon, which is really an expansion of an already existing section in the weekday recitation found in the blessings that lead up and precede the recitation of the Shema, and therefore it's called Yotzrot, based on the term Yotzer or Uvorei Choshech. Okay? So we might ask, what's the purpose of these piyutim? According to some, they are cantorial expositions to enhance the worship by emphasizing Hashem's glory and grandeur. Yet there are scholars of Jewish liturgy that suggest a deeper and a more subtle explanation. They point out that the high point of such literature, both in Spain as well as Central Europe, was during the Middle Ages. This was a time when many Jewish communities lived under an oppressive authority, and that authority curtailed and even persecuted the Jewish community, particularly for ongoing Torah study and intensive learning. In fact, it didn't matter whether that authority was Muslim or Christian. However, they did permit Jews to worship. And since worship was permitted, we'd suggest to these scholars that that was really the only outlet, if you will, for the examination and the interpretation of Jewish sources. It was the only opportunity where one could refer to Torah or to Mishnah or to Gemara or to Midrash. And so therefore references to Torah, to Midrash and Gemara were written in to these liturgical poems, these piyutim, and thus they became vehicles to present Torah and rabbinic concepts and values to the general population attending in shul. Now, how were they written? Well, they were written like poetry. Some were composed with an alphabetical acrostic, for example, Aleph Beis. Some were written in rhyme, and still others were written so that the initial letter of each stanza actually spelled out the name of the author. Now, there were later rabbinic authorities, like Rabbi Jacob Emden, who questioned the need for such liturgical selections, because they said they distract the worshiper from the more essential prayers. But many of these liturgical poems were still retained, particularly in the Ashkenazic minhag. Now, Akdamut, or Akdamut Milin, as some call it, might be considered by some authorities in this category of piyut, of liturgical poetry. But there is also something very unique about Akdamut, and that's why we're investigating it in a little bit more detail. We all know that Akdamut is recited first day of Shavuot. And in fact, what's interesting, if we go into the history just a little bit, we know that Eliezer Levi, in his book on the fundamentals of Jewish prayer, suggests that already in the time of the Gaonim, that there were these liturgical poems associated with Shavuot. He mentions, in fact, a name, that many of them were called azharot, warnings or precautions. And he suggests that they were warnings or precautions to come to tell the people in attendance that soon they would be hearing the Torah reading, and to remind them that the Taryag mitzvot were all based on the Aseret HaDibrot, on the 10 Commandments. And so therefore there's a long history of having liturgical poems associated with Shavuot. Now, besides this mention, we know that Saadia Gaon himself wrote some of these piyutim, and that they were included in the worship, particularly on this occasion of Shavuot, because again, it emphasized the giving and the receiving of the Torah. And it shouldn't surprise us. But sometimes they were written in Hebrew, and sometimes they were written in Aramaic, as the example we have with Akdamut. We do know that already in the time of the Gaonim, there was another practice that was done in the synagogue, also connected with Aramaic. And that was the fact that they would recite verbally a targum, a translation of the Torah reading during the reading itself, while it was read. Now, this Aramaic translation, if you will, by a maturgaman, a synagogue professional, was done during the Torah portion on Shabbat, a few verses at a time, into Aramaic for the benefit of those in attendance in the synagogue. And this practice was continued well into the Middle Ages, because we actually have machzorim. We have like machzor vitri, which is from the 12th century, that already included these Aramaic sections printed in the machzor itself for people to be able to follow it on Shavuot in order to emphasize the significance of the revelation at Sinai for those that were about to hear it later on in the Shavuot Torah reading. Here perhaps is the best point that we can tie it into Akdamut, because here it seems that Akdamut could be suggested, since it's written in Aramaic itself, that it became a preamble or an introduction to this Aramaic translation of the Shavuot Torah reading. Now, that kind of a piyut was called a reshut. It sought permission to introduce the topic that was going to be discussed and to emphasize some aspect of it. In fact, Rabbi Eli Monk, in his book, The World of Prayer, suggests that if the Aramaic translation was going to be recited within part of the Kohen Aliyah on Shavuot, then it seems reasonable that a piyut preparing the congregation for the reading of Matan Torah would be appropriate as an introduction to this Aramaic translation. As I said, it was called a reshut, or a permission. And not only would it alert the congregation that the Aseret HaDibrot was about to be read, but it also contained additional themes. One of those themes would be to praise Hashem as the creator of the heaven and earth, who chose Israel, the Jewish people, to be the recipients of his Torah. Not only is this a special role then for the Jewish people, because it's then our responsibility to proclaim Hashem's majesty to the nations. At the same time, it acknowledges the terrible price of persecution and oppression the Jewish people have suffered and were continuing to suffer and to bear, but it also promised them a day in the future when there would be a time of redemption, perhaps in Olam Haba, in the world to come. Now, according to most authorities, traditional and academic, this Akdamut was this preamble written by an 11th century Chazan and Rabbi Meir ben Isaac Nehorai of Orleans, and it was written specifically for the Jewish community of Worms, Germany, in the Rhineland. The first 44 verses were a double acrostic of the Aleph Beis, while the first letters that remain afterwards spell out his name and an important message to the participants. Now, we might ask, who was this Rabbi Meir ben Yitzchak? Apparently, he was a contemporary of Rashi. Not only that, but he was held in high regard, because we find that at least in two places in Rashi's commentary, one in the book of Hosea and elsewhere in the book of Tehillim, Rashi actually cites him by name as his authority for explaining the verses. Not only that, but we also discover that Tosafot also recognize a number of his other liturgical poems. And later authorities, like the Maharshal, also refer to him by name as an important figure among the early Rishonim. Now, how many of these liturgical poems did Rabbi Meir ben Yitzchak write? Well, academic scholars find that he wrote 48 different kinds of piyutim. The majority in Hebrew, 39, but at least 9 others, like Akdamut, written in Aramaic. Okay, so if we've suggested that Akdamut serves then as a kind of prelude to the Aramaic translation of the Shavuot Torah reading, and it encourages us to praise Hashem for the gift of the Torah and to share its message, when and why is it still recited today? After all, we could argue the following. Once we had written Targumim, right, and once they were accepted, was there any need then for the Aramaic translation in the synagogue? We know eventually that that was stopped, certainly by the end of the Middle Ages. Okay? Furthermore, if it was originally recited by interrupting, so to speak, the Kohen Haliyah, how and why was it moved to be recited instead after the Kohen was called up for his Aliyah, but before his Aliyah is actually read? And as a matter of fact, if you look in the art scroll, or you look in the Koren, Machzorim or Sidurim, you'll see that it specifically says that that's the place that it's to be done in synagogue. Now, by the later Middle Ages, by the 14th century, we know that this Aramaic translation was stopped because few congregation, were familiar enough with the Aramaic to appreciate its meaning. Instead, what did they do? They put Hebrew announcements, were composed, and other translations were written to be able to tell the congregation that soon they would hear the reading of the Aseret HaDibrot, the Ten Commandments. Okay? But there was another problem, and that was the one raised by some medieval poskim, the Rambam included, who pointed out that there's a citation in the Gemara in Sota 39a that says that once a Sefer Torah is opened in preparation for the Torah reading, okay, it's improper to have any kind of recitation, whether it's of a halachic nature or not, once the Torah reading has begun. So the only exception, the Gemara suggested, was something necessary directly to the Torah reading itself. Thus, we find already at this point that some poskim, like the Taz, for example, ruled it inappropriate to recite Akdamut following the first verse of the normal Kohen Torah reading, even though that verse ended with the word Midbar Sinai, which would be an appropriate place then for the Akdamut, as it was traditionally done to be recited. Okay? Now, while some poskim did not accept the view of the Taz to move Akdamut from its, so to speak, traditional location, Rabbi Yaakov Emden and others supported the move. Okay? They argued for its recitation to precede the Torah reading after the Kohen had been called up for his aliyah. And as I said, both the Art Scroll and Koren Sidurim follow this practice of having its recitation before starting the Torah reading and before the Kohen makes his brachas. Now, again, we still have the problem, right? Akdamut is only recited in the Ashkenazic ritual. Why isn't it found elsewhere? Okay? It's not found in the Sephardic ritual. It's not found in Hasidic practices. What then was the reason that Ashkenazic community would retain it? And even to retain it, why did they do so after it got transferred from its original place? Right? Now, it's interesting that few writers actually attempt to address this question, whether traditional sources or the more academic sources. But I believe that for us, particularly in our situation today, it is very relevant for our understanding of this piyut. Recently, there have been a series of 3 books or 4 books from YU that deal with various aspects of Jewish worship. And one of those books deals with holiday davening. And in there, a Rabbi Michael Taubus of YU, also happens to be a pulpit rabbi in Teaneck, for those who know the Teaneck community. Okay? He suggests or attempts an answer to this question. His answer is a homiletical rationale for why they maintained the piyut. He suggests that after mentioning that its melody is the same as that which was used for the evening Kiddush on Shalosh Regalim, and it's also the same melody that's used for the poem on Simchas Torah, to call up the Chatan Torah, or to call up the Chatan Bereshis. He then suggests the following, and I'm quoting from his article. What we are doing by keeping Akdamut in our worship, he suggests, is by having a human composition accompany and even introduce the reading of the Torah on the very day on which we read about and mark the giving of the Torah, Zman Matan Toratenu. It's declaring that the Torah is now ours and that we have a say in interpreting it and hence in perpetuating it, and that it is our responsibility to keep it relevant by adhering to its lofty standards. Now, while I commend Rabbi Taubes for his explanation, as well as the fact that he brings as additional proof a citation from Rav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik in support of his idea that the recitation of the piyut comes to help us, we'll call it, eternalize the Torah. I believe he has missed an important aspect of the piyut, which is particularly available to us under the current circumstances. Since few of us today totally comprehend the Aramaic text or are completely competent in singing its melody, I might suggest that in our personal davening, we read through the English translation to see how the author not only attempts to describe for his audience, so to speak, the mystical events occurring in heaven during the giving of the Torah, which in reality is not too much unlike what we find in the Kedusha blessings of the Amidah, when we recite the 4 different Shabbat Amidas, where it talks about the behavior of the angels in each case and our relationship to them. But it also focuses on the unique status of the Jewish people as the recipients of such a gift. In doing so, it acknowledges the Jewish people's responsibility to share such a message with humanity, but at the same time, having had to suffer oppression and persecution in the past and in the present. And this is particularly significant because in one of those academic articles written by a professor, Jeffrey Hoffman, he points out that precisely at this time, there was a terrible onslaught of the Rhineland Jewish communities in Worms, in Speyer, and elsewhere as a result of the First Crusade. And large numbers of Jews were killed, or if not killed, were severely impacted. And so therefore, I'm suggesting that towards the end of the piyut, which was written around that same time, the author, offers and makes the following prayer of hope and redemption, of a better future. And he closes, after affixing his name, with a concluding message that I believe is relevant and was relevant, not only for those of his generation, but for later generations of Ashkenazic Jewry who would remember the impact of that oppression and of those slaughters, right? But even has a message for us today. The Akdamut closes with the words, Yigadel Torah uma'asim tovim chazak va'amatz. To grow in Torah learning, to perform good deeds, be strong and courageous. It is this message, I would suggest, this almost blessing, which he felt the gift of Torah imparted on Shavuot gives to the Jewish people and would help them persevere in every generation. May we too, during this unique and difficult time of learning together while we are physically apart, also make the effort to grow in Torah learning, to perform ma'asim tovim, good deeds wherever and however possible, and be strong and courageous as we renew our commitment to Torah with the coming Shavuot holiday. I take this opportunity to wish you and all of our Torah or family best wishes for an early Chag Shavuot Sameach. Thank you for your participation.
Shkar, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Oh,
Okay.
Everybody stay
thank you,
well.
Rabbi Greene.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good job.
Thank you very
Thank you, Rabbi Greene.
Greene. Thank you.
Everybody,
Thank you. Chag Sameach. Thank
Chag
you.
Sameach.
good luck and everyone should stay well.
To you and your family.
Irene, I think I may have given you the wrong number. So